Well, thank you, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I am very lucky to get to introduce Lindsey Krinks. Lindsey Krinks is co-founder and director of education at Open Table Nashville, an interfaith homeless outreach nonprofit. Over the last 15 years, she has worked on the streets of Nashville as an outreach worker, community organizer, street chaplain, and educator. She is committed to evidence-based practices, anti-racism, transformative justice, and working towards a future that includes housing for all. Her book, Praying with Our Feet, Pursuing Justice and Healing on the Streets, debuted in 2021. Most recently, Lindsey has played a key role in advocating for the rights of people experiencing homelessness through her protest against the Tennessee legislation that criminalizes homelessness. In July of this year, she helped organize Tennessee Night of Action Against the Criminalization of Homelessness, an event that invited organizations, individuals, and faith leaders from across Tennessee to join with other homeless advocates and service providers in rallying, marching, and sleeping out to denounce the new anti-camping law and unjust camp closures. The title of her presentation is House Keys, Not Handcuffs, Ending the Criminalization of Homelessness in Tennessee. Please give her a warm welcome.
Hi, Memphis. I bring greetings from Nashville. It is so nice to be with y'all. It's been so fun. My coworker Claire and I are here today representing for our organization, but it's been so fun to hear some of the things y'all are talking about that go hand in hand with what we're going to be talking about today during this lunch session. Hopefully you're happy and the food is yummy and good. Please feel free to move around as you need. We're going to get rolling, and please feel free to jump in if you have any questions or want to add on to what we're saying. You know, in Tennessee, the more we network together and the more we get to know each other and the more we start building solidarity across county lines, the stronger we're going to be when it comes to legislation that is damaging the rights and taking away the rights of our people across the state. So we're really excited about getting to know you. We are Open Table Nashville. I helped co-found this group in 2010. I've been working on the streets for 15 years. I'm older than I look. But our mission at Open Table Nashville is to disrupt cycles of poverty, journey with the marginalized, and provide education about issues of homelessness. The disrupting part is what gets us into some trouble sometimes. But it's also the only thing that's actually going to break cycles of poverty and not just perpetuate them. None of us in the nonprofit work want to just perpetuate the need for our own services. We want to end homelessness. We want to work ourselves out of a job. So that's where we come in. You can see just a little bit so you're familiar with the work that we're doing on the ground. We are very much boots on the ground. I have my hiking shoes on. These are my outreach shoes that I wear to everywhere. We are boots on the ground organization. Not only are we doing the direct service, but we're also doing some of the education work. We believe we can't break cycles of poverty if we don't understand them. We don't have an analysis of those cycles of poverty, right? And then the advocacy and policy work is some of that disrupting those cycles work. When we go to decision makers and we ask for change, we beg for change, change is the right thing, housing is the right thing, and they don't give that to us, we get louder. Our people's lives are at stake, and you know that better than anybody else. As someone who has done chaplaincy, I'm burying people. I'm burying people in their 30s and 40s and 50s. And you are too. And we believe in a world, a future that's better than this. And we believe that that world is possible. So here's a little bit about what we're going to do during this lunch session. Let's talk about what's going on in Tennessee and across the country. We're going to do a brief history of the criminalization of homelessness, which we've talked about in a couple of the sessions that I've been in already with Dr. De La Vega and Josh Stickler. We're going to talk about what can be done about the criminalization of homelessness in Tennessee and some next steps. We are very interested in building and doing some statewide organizing. There has never been, to my knowledge, statewide with deep roots coalition that works on issues exclusively of housing and homelessness. There is possibility, y'all. So let's talk about that. So let's talk about what's going on. Here's some of the things that we're going to hit during this part of the presentation. What is going on? We know there's a housing crisis our people on the front lines of it. We are on the front lines of it. We know that people working full time cannot live in this city, in this state, and in this country without subsidies or without doubling and tripling up. This is wrong. This is incredibly wrong. The National Low Income Housing Coalition has some very depressing statistics, and we know, what is the minimum wage in Tennessee? $7.25, the lowest in the country. We know costs are rising. That's one of the root causes of homelessness, right? Inflation is going up. The cost of living are going up. Housing costs are going up. What are our wages doing?
Staying the same.
Nashville rent, right? Nashville rent. We've gone from about $750 about 10 years ago for a one-bedroom. Average rent is $15.94 right now. Have the wages changed for the minimum wage workers in that time? Absolutely not. We know these root causes are what's driving so many folks, so many families that are experiencing homelessness. This is not okay. We in Nashville, for instance, 93% of the apartments we built in the last 10 years, luxury condos. One of my friends, Dr. Sekou Franklin, he's a professor at NTSU and does a lot around civil rights, he said, Nashville, but we could also say Tennessee, is being built like a playground for the rich and a prison for the poor. It kind of is like that old saying that many of us have heard and books that have been written that say, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting prison. That is what we're seeing. So, we also know that the pandemic, and we still haven't seen, talked about this in earlier sessions, we still haven't seen the numbers and the data that have come to show how deep the pandemic plunged so many Americans. But we know that across the nation and across Tennessee, there's an increase in outdoor homelessness, invisible homelessness, because of the pandemic. We know that a lot of people were evicted. We know that a lot of people faced incredible odds with unemployment and underemployment. We know that a lot of the shelters had difficulties during the pandemic, but we know that there are more visible folks experiencing homelessness. And that is true in our PIT counts too, our point-in-time counts, right? So what does Tennessee do about this increase in visible homelessness after the pandemic, after an economic and public health crisis? Our legislators, these men, sorry, I have to put up a picture. I'm the chaplain, but I'm irreverent because I've worked on the streets for 15 years. Okay, these are the men. So this, what we'll refer to as the anti-camping bill, SB 1610, that passed this year. This originated in Cookeville because Cookeville in 2020 and 2021 was seeing an increase in visible homelessness on their rants because of the pandemic and the economic downturn, right? So they see an increase in visible homelessness. So on a city level, they try to pass something that really penalizes panhandlers and keeps people from doing what they're doing in public. And they failed. The city of Cookeville shut them down. They didn't get it passed at a city level. So they passed it off to one of their representatives and said, we couldn't get this passed at the city level, we want you to pass it at the state level. And they said, all right. And they brought it to the state level. In 2021, this bill comes before us. We were blindsided by it. We were not expecting this at all. You know, we're in Nashville, where the capital is. And we get hints that, you know, this bill has just been introduced, what is happening. So we start tracking it at the committee level. We were able to help shut this down in 2021. We mobilized very quickly, but it came back this year. And even though we were organized, in Tennessee, you can be organized. Nashville, Memphis, Chattanooga, and Knoxville, we can be organized together. But if we're not organizing the rural parts of the state, we're not winning in these sessions. So we were organized, and we flipped a lot of votes, but it wasn't enough to keep this from passing. So an amended version passed. So it went into effect July 1st. We had a huge rally and protest and march, which you'll see pictures of in Sleep Out, where a lot of us participated in civil disobedience. We didn't get arrested. They don't like to arrest college students and people with their clergy collars on, right? They like to arrest other folks. So none of us got arrested, but this passed. So what does this bill actually say and what does it do? So this bill is confusing, and it was hard to educate people about it. But there's a couple different sections of this bill. The first one actually makes certain offenses, like sleeping on or being on a shoulder berm or right away of a state interstate or highway, a Class C misdemeanor, punishable by up to like a $50 fine and community service. That's weird because the rest of the law does something incredibly different. So when the people were trying to pass this, they would say, well, it's a misdemeanor for these offenses. And we'd say, no, but you're making it a felony for everything else. So this is the first part, and this is what was so visible. The second part, sections 2 through 5, expand this. Terribly named, Non-Equal Access to Public Property Act. But the history around this, the Equal Access to Public Property Act of 2012. Does anybody remember why in 2012 the state legislature passed something that made it a Class C misdemeanor to sleep on state land? Occupy, which I was a part of and had to get arrested for. But it was a reaction to an economic protest that they made it a misdemeanor to sleep on state property. Then in 2020, that same law was amended to make it a felony to sleep on state property. Do y'all remember what was happening in 2020? Yeah, George Floyd, racial justice protests, people at the Capitol. So the lawmakers again reacted, making it a felony to be on state property. Well, they expanded, with sections 2 through 5 of this bill, they expanded that to cover all public property, except for these small things, which is really unclear, and I don't know how they're going to prosecute and pull this out of the other public property, but leave that up to them. So it's essentially making it a Class E felony with up to 6 years in prison, a $3,000 fine, and the loss of voting rights. To sleep on public property across our state. Who owns public property? We do. We pay for public property. We're going to talk about what this means, like what this means on a larger scale when we talk about the history of criminalization in a few minutes. But this is a really big deal. Do we have enough shelter beds in the state of Tennessee for everybody? Do we have enough affordable housing in the state for everybody? So we are essentially criminalizing a whole class of people that involuntarily do not have the resources they need to survive and to be sheltered. And that is unconstitutional. So we made this argument, as did a number of others that spoke out against this bill. In 2019, have any of y'all heard about the Martin versus Boise case? This ruled in 2019 that it is unconstitutional for governments to prosecute people for sleeping in public when they have nowhere else to go. It's a violation of the 8th Amendment, which is freedom from cruel and unusual punishment, right? So this passed in the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals. Tennessee's in the 6th Circuit Court, so it's a different, right? So it's a different kind of thing. But it took 9 years for that to make its way through. But that did establish the unconstitutionality of our current law in some ways. So we're trying to lean on that, and we will be using that for legal challenges. Now, here's a question. Has anybody heard of this institute? You will start hearing about them in the next year. There are people, it wasn't just the guy in the cowboy hat who I showed you, the representative center, that were pushing this legislation. There are think tanks that are anti-housing first, that are pushing model legislation like the one that was passed in Texas, like the one that was passed in Tennessee, and the one passed recently in Missouri that criminalizes homelessness. And they are involved in camping bans, and trying to get camping bans passed across the United States. Several of the camping bans and other laws that they tried to pass in 2021 and 22 failed. But we'll talk more about them in a minute. But guess who made their appearance? I had to go back through the videos a few days ago. But when this bill was in the committee in 2021, we testified against it. Guess who testified for it? This random guy on Zoom that nobody had ever seen or heard of before. Guess who he's with? The Cicero Institute, the same institute that is pushing other bills across the country that are defunding housing first programs, passing camping bans across different states, and let me show you. Here's the kind of hallmarks of the legislation that they're trying to pass, and I'll show you where that's happening elsewhere in the country. So they're trying to pass statewide camping bans, which has happened effectively in Tennessee now. We have a statewide camping ban. They're also trying to allow attorney generals to sue communities, like say our DA in Nashville refused to prosecute these crimes, right? The attorney general could sue our community or put someone else in place to prosecute. And that is true because of the Tennessee law that was passed last year. So that's a whole thing. Your DA's race is important. Your races are important, right? They matter. The second kind of hallmark is, and this we are seeing in the new law in Missouri, which I'll show you in a minute, a denial of public funds to homeless communities, to nonprofits. These are state funds and federal funds that don't comply with the camping bans or won't comply with law enforcement who are enacting these. And then the third hallmark we're seeing is the creation of sanctioned encampments and there are good things about places where people can be safely. But what is incredibly problematic that is happening across the country right now is creating sanctioned encampments that is the only place for people to be, and then forcibly relocating folks from being around in the community where they're trying to integrate in the community, where they're working in their neighborhoods and sleeping behind somewhere or whatever. Forcibly relocating them on the outskirts of town to large patches of land where it is likened to what the National Coalition for the Homeless Council or Homeless Group has likened to internment camps. So there are some pretty disturbing trends that we're seeing, and you need to know this is happening. You can take a look at some of the other states just this year that these kind of things have been tried. We're following this with, our group is meeting regularly with the National Homelessness Law Center, National Coalition for the Homeless, and the National Alliance to End Homelessness to talk about what we're seeing happen and what our strategies against this. But y'all, this is affecting Tennessee. We have one of the harshest criminalization bills in the whole entire country that passed in our state. This is a really big deal. And I just want to show you Missouri. I want you just to be able to look at this for a minute. This is the National Coalition for the Homeless's summary of the Missouri law that just passed. Notice a few of the things. This is one that Cicero Institute actively lobbied for and helped pass. What do you notice as you're looking at this? What stands out to you? The hallmarks of this Missouri law.
The tiny homes.
I can't hear y'all. What stands out to y'all?
Tiny homes were housing first.
Yeah. We know how fickle that point in time count number is. We do it. We're the people who do it. We know the problems with it. There's a lot of issues with this. So just to show you, this is the group that's celebrating that law. They are active and they are organized. And if we are going to combat some of the legislation that is going to come about homelessness into Tennessee next year and the year after that, then we need to organize as folks on the ground and on the front lines of this. We know that the criminalization of homelessness is not effective. We know it doesn't work. Here's a few reasons it doesn't work from the National Homelessness Law Center and a recent report that they did, asking for house keys and housing instead of handcuffs. we know it doesn't work. We know that the only thing that ends homelessness is what? Housing. We spent sessions talking about affordable housing here. This is what we're devoted to, a housing for all. We believe housing is a human right. It's not a commodity. It shouldn't be a commodity for some to profit off of. It should be a right for all. We know that housing first ends homelessness, and we know that communities like Houston, which we mentioned in an earlier session, and the way we've cut veteran homelessness is because of our investments, our strategic investments in housing vouchers and strategic outreach to the folks that are struggling the most, right? So we know it ends homelessness. Yet what we're seeing across the nation is folks who are trying to say that they need, I think what Josh Stickler from Just City said in the session before this that I was in, he quoted some folks that say the hammer of citations, the hammer of arrest, the hammer of criminal justice system doesn't work. Like, we need housing. We know it ends homelessness. This is from the recent July 1st protests. So I'm going to pause for a minute. Questions or reactions? We know we cannot address homelessness with sanctioned encampments. We know we can't address homelessness with tents or jail time or, heaven forbid, felonies, because we know what is so much harder when people have felonies. Everything. So I want to pause and see if there are any questions so far or things that stood out, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the brief history of criminalization and what we can do about it, which is what I really want to get into. Keep rolling for a minute. So anybody want to do a very brief history of criminalization of homelessness? I'm a nerd. I am devoted to ending homelessness. This is something that my family has struggled with. I lost my home. My husband and I lost our home when we were pregnant in a tornado not too long, 2 years ago. But my family has struggled with homelessness. We know that it was really around 1400s, 1500s, 1600s that we started seeing the first vagrancy laws emerge. And this is really where, and this is the briefest history that you'll ever get, so I'm going to go through this quickly. We can talk more about it if you want. We're like jumping through centuries. But we had a mention of this, some of the vagabond laws of 1494 that were mentioned in an earlier session. But they're really criminalizing idleness. Able-bodied people who are refusing to work for the production of other people's wealth, right? There's no labor laws. there's like children working, like there's no safe workplaces. These are people that are refusing to work for the profit of others, and they're criminalizing that as idleness. Then later, we see the Enclosure Acts. Are y'all familiar with the Enclosure Acts in England? You know, if you fly over the UK, it's patchwork, right? Because of all the rock walls and the hedges that were built to enclose common lands and privatize those lands. Those are the Enclosure Acts, right? And they evicted all of the peasants and people who made their living and just subsistence on these commonly tenured lands. It kicked them off and pushed them to the cities where, again, they would need to use their bodies for the production of wealth for others, right? Where the others would profit on, and they would barely make subsistence. So we have the Enclosure Acts, we have the birth of capitalism, we have the expansion of vagrancy laws. Then, and this is interesting to me, in the 1700s and 1800s, we really have the emergence of policing. That is happening first in London on the docks, and it's happening first in Charleston, South Carolina. Why? Slave patrols. To police human beings as property, okay? These are the first instances of policing that resemble modern policing that we have today. To police black bodies and poor bodies who could be the labor and wealth production of others. We see the first prisons really being used to put people from vagrancy laws in. We have people being executed for vagrancy laws, the violation of vagrancy laws. We could go way into that, but we're going to skip to do another big leap to the end of slavery. Then we have this repackaging of vagrancy laws to pick up formerly enslaved people to re-exploit their labor through the convict policing system and the jail labor and things like that. And then what I'm going to spend a minute on here is what I think De La Vega earlier called the erosion of the welfare state in the 1970s and 80s. Do y'all know which decade in U.S. history researchers say mass homelessness in America began? 1980s.
Oh, the 80s.
What was happening?
HIV epidemic.
Wait,
Crack, HIV,
HIV epidemic.
HIV epidemic?
the mandatory minimum strikes laws,
Yep.
and
War on drugs
Yeah.
is starting to happen.
right.
The deinstitutionalization of health hospitals is happening. There's a recession, right? And the Reagan administration responds to the recession by gutting the funding for HUD and gutting the social safety nets that the New Deal and the Great Society Act had put in place.
Oh, wow.
And some people have called this, there's one author that I really like, Ruth Wilson Gilmore. She's an abolitionist, and she says, what took place in the 1980s was organized abandonment of people who were in poverty,
Oh, wow.
the Black community, organized abandonment. And then what came after that was the organized violence of the carceral state and system. So we see the rise in mass incarceration, which we talked about in the last session I was in, right? Are y'all familiar? Who has heard of broken windows policing? That's the operative policing that's still happening in our communities today. And we need to be aware of what this is happening, like what this is, because this is affecting us. How many of y'all do outreach work, so you're out in the community? How many of y'all are part of service stories that people come into you, or you're still interfacing day in, day out, hearing these stories? We know this. We need to understand why it is like this. So broken windows policing was instituted. The first mention of it comes out in 1984 in an article in the Atlantic, and then it's instituted in the early 1990s in New York under Giuliani's police force. But broken windows policing says any sign of visible disorder in our community will lead to greater crime. Any broken window will lead to bigger crime. So if we patch up that window, and if we get rid of that visible disorder, then we can solve the problem. We can prevent crime. What's the problem with that theory? It doesn't address root causes. It says the problem is the person on the street corner who is visibly poor and just unkempt. Not the society that has produced that. Not the divestment from housing and social services and other things that have happened over the last 40 plus years, right? So this broken windows policing theory, which we can talk way more about, really results in the 2000s, which many of us have seen, the quality of life ordinances, right? That's where we're picking up folks for low-level things like obstructing the passageway. How many times have I gone to court with somebody for obstructing the passageway, or sitting under an awning to get out of the rain, or crossing through a private parking lot just to get to the next service? How many times have we gone to court with people for these very petty things? Quality of life. So that is probably the quickest history of some of the criminalization that we can give. And I'm going to jump now quickly, of course. I love that. This is a piece of artwork being installed in my neighborhood right now. You don't fight poverty with policing. I want to go quickly through what we're seeing in terms of the camps. And we want to know, we want more connections with y'all, so we're in touch more. We want to do some coalition building in the next year, but here's some of the things we're seeing. In Nashville alone, 30 encampments have been closed just this year that we've documented, that we know of. Chattanooga is seeing similar things. They've seen more threats of closures of encampments. They've seen more fear and stress in people. That's the same thing that Knoxville and Murfreesboro. I'm interested in what y'all are seeing in other rural areas. You can read some of the trends we're hearing about and we're seeing. got to start talking more, right? So what can we do? What can we do? So this old saying from the suffragists and from civil rights leaders, educate, agitate, organize. You need to know what you can do. A lot of people in nonprofits and faith communities don't realize that you can advocate and lobby. So what are some of the rules, right? What are some of the rules? For 501c3s like we are at Open Table Nashville, here's what we can do. We can do cause-related advocacy all day long. We can do educational things like this. We can do lobbying to a certain extent. There's not a lot of really strict defining marks around how much lobbying we can do. It can't be more than it can't be a substantial part of our work. But a lot of people say it can be as long as we're not spending 20% of our budget on lobbying, then that falls within the accepted realm of what we can do. We can't endorse candidates, that kind of thing. But specific legislation, yes, you can do. And when you're on your own time, you should have freedom to do the advocacy and lobbying you want. There are some things to be careful about using our organization's letterhead and things like that, but there's a lot we can do. Now, advocacy is the bigger bubble in which lobbying for specific legislation fits in, right? And there are some differences. Like when we're talking about lobbying, that's about specific legislation. So if your community, one of the things we want to develop this next year is an advocacy training for nonprofits on the statewide level. So we will be working on that. If you want us to come into your nonprofit or your group, we would love to do that and talk to you about what is possible and what is not, and how to figure out how these pieces work. We're not going to go through this. So that's the educate part, is understanding what we can do and how things work so that we can change things. There are a lot of ways that we need to be tracking what's going on in our communities and telling the stories. Our folks, things are happening and nobody ever knows. Right. We have to bear witness to the reality, to the living hell that our people are living in, so that we can transform that and get a better society. We are working on, with a whole legal team, with some national law groups and local law groups, like the Tennessee ACLU, on a Google form through the Solidarity Network that I'll talk about in a minute, that will allow us to track some of the criminalization of homelessness. You've seen this little bit.ly sign up. At any point, you can sign up for that, and I'll tell you about the Tennessee Solidarity Network in just a minute. But we would love to stay in touch. We need to be tracking this together. And then we can organize. Community organizers have always held that there are two forms of power for social change: organized money and organized people. When we don't have organized money, like the corporations and lawyers and lobbyists in Cicero Institute, we organize ourselves. And that is how we create change. So we've started with some others, the Tennessee Solidarity Network for Housing and Homelessness. Right now, it's just a network. What we're hoping will develop in the next year is some relationships through that network that will then form into a statewide coalition that has representation, strong representation, from urban and rural districts and counties, so that we can work together on proactive legislation around housing and rights. So please join us for this. We're sending updates through this, and that is kind of our organizing method right now. So far, we have 41 counties out of the 95 counties of Tennessee represented in that Solidarity Network. That's a lot, but it's not where we want to be, so we've got to push even further. So y'all, so many of y'all are in Shelby County, but you know people outside of Shelby County. We need those connections, and we need to be building together. So again, we have a needs survey that we've put out. That needs survey asks things like, what are you seeing? What are some of the big issues? What are some of the most helpful things that you need from a Solidarity Network? Is it a Know Your Rights training for yourself, your staff members, your people? Is it a political education training that you need for your nonprofit to understand the inner workings of council or state government? What do you need? And how can we kind of put what we're doing to scroll through some pictures from July 1st because it's incredibly powerful, and then I'll close out with a few minutes of Q&A. It's an incredibly powerful night. It's when we marched on Broadway. So our friend Terry was a leader at Jefferson Street Bridge Camp that was closed this spring. There is power in people when we organize together. So we are working, our next steps are mounting legal challenges. We're meeting every couple weeks right now with these groups. And if you are an attorney and you want to join this work, or if you want to be in the loop on this, email me, join up on the Solidarity Network. We will send updates. How can we support what you're saying and what you're doing? The legal challenges are going to be incredibly important. We know that litigation is an effective tool of fighting criminalization, so we are using that. We are going to be using that, but in order to do this, we have to track what's happening. We have to know what's happening. We are hoping and planning for February or March of this year to have a day on the Hill for housing and homelessness, which I don't know if that's ever been done before in the state of Tennessee in a specific way, but inviting people from as many of those 95 counties as we can to come to Nashville and to meet your elected officials and really start organizing together and hopefully coalition building together. We want to hire a statewide organizer who travels around to our different counties building relationships. We want to lay that foundation for relationships and coalition building and explore proactive legislation so we're not always on the defensive, which is exhausting, right? You know that. Too often, that's all we do. So we have a lot that we want to do. It's really easy to find your legislators, but we can talk more about that. Here's some groups, if you're interested in staying connected. We do a lot with these national advocacy groups, gotten way more involved with them over the last year. But we're learning as we go, like all of y'all. Like we're a small nonprofit, but we have a vision for coalition building that goes way beyond our nonprofit, that is not held by our nonprofit, but is held by Tennesseans who are committed to ending homelessness. We want to build that with y'all. So please sign up for this. There are some additional resources. Many have already been talked about today. There are some fun stories about campsite defenses and cop watches that we've organized at camps that were facing eviction and the Pray With Our Feet that came out last year. And I'm a nerd and read a lot about other things and the history of these things stuff too. So I want to pause because this was a lot to put in, especially because I talked so much about the history of criminalization, which it's very vast and interesting. But I want to pause for a minute and ask what questions you have, or what comments you have. What do you see happening here? So any of that is open. And very good. Yes?
One of the issues with here in Memphis is our VA, the current VA and the candidate for VA have both said they have no intention of prosecuting the new laws for sleeping in public. And I think it was really fascinating for you to make the distinction between urban and rural areas. It sounds like the rural areas are moving forward with those efforts, and the urban areas are so there's a growing divide.
There's a big divide, absolutely.
What does that say about our need to build a network that includes both?
That is the future. That's the future. If we're going to move things as a state in the right direction toward human rights, toward housing for all, we've got to build in those rural areas, and we need those connections, and we need to be building those relationships together. Yeah, very well said. Thank you. What other things come to your mind, or other questions that you have?
I'd like to know, where do you see healthcare fitting in this? Because you could offer a home to someone not staying.
Yeah, well, I mean, the model that we've been pushing toward is housing first, right? We know that housing first works, providing that housing for folks and then those wraparound services for them. We can't talk about housing in a vacuum from racial justice or health justice or any of these other justice issues. They're all interconnected. So that healthcare piece is crucial, right? But without that housing and that stability, that's the housing first philosophy, right? Without that stable place to land, then people's health care will never be resolved because they're in the elements and they're moving around and they can't eat well. And so get that housing first, and then let's wrap around these other services. So healthcare is crucial, mental health care. We can't get people in substance use treatment sometimes because they don't have insurance, right? They're uninsured.
Yes.
It's incredibly difficult for
Yeah.
people that want help.
Yeah.
So how can we be working on those things? But we've got to stop criminalizing first,
Right.
right? That's just going to make everything worse. That's like the thing to not do, and then we can do all these amazing things together. But yeah, great question.
Agencies and organizations that are opposing your work, what do you think the motivation is for that?
You know, people want a quick fix. The senators and representatives that voted for this, they want a quick fix for their community. They don't want to see people. They don't want business leaders coming to them saying, this is hurting my business, right? Because also those business leaders are supporting their campaigns. But they want a quick fix. And they think incarcerating and giving people the stick, right? And the hammer is gonna make that happen. We know that housing is actually more effective and it's more cost effective down the road. It's so much cheaper to put people in a home and surround them with services than it is to keep them spinning through the criminal legal system, which many of us can no longer call the criminal justice system because there's nothing just about it. We cannot keep them spinning through the criminal legal system or the hospital system, right? So it's cheaper, it works, it's better for taxpayers. We're using that with fiscal conservatives. Listen, look at the research. It's less expensive.
Yeah.
So it should be a win-win, but people want a quick fix, and the stereotypes are so big in people's minds. They don't see our people as human beings. They've forgotten.
Forget everything.
Yeah.
Human first.
Yeah.
You just mentioned the Day on the Hill. There's already a Day on the Hill for Affordable Housing Coalition, so have you thought about just joining with that so you can show how affordable housing is the first step to stop homelessness?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We want one that specifically does address homelessness, but yes, absolutely. And those are the kind of connections that really need to be made between now and then. And that's why we need some of y'all. I cannot, none of us can do this alone. I'm standing here because we've spent a lot of time doing this and because we're in Nashville and got the word first on some of this stuff, but this is not my thing. This is not Open Table Nashville's thing. This has to be something that is our thing together because none of us can do this alone and none of us have all the connections we need in our own silo. So relationship building is going to be crucial, right? Relationship building is going to be crucial. Yeah.
And I'm just happy you're out here speaking to us on this because we see it every day. We drive to work, the writing's on the wall. We're just waiting for it to really hit because you have people from Nashville, from Memphis, because they can't afford the house.
Yes.
Whereas we already have people here who are looking who can't afford the housing, and you can see from downtown all the development of the high-priced buildings. $1,300-$1,400, like you said, a month is here now. And it used to be the $450 building, it's now be $1,400.
Yeah.
And then my question is, as we go further, where do these people go? Because downtown, midtown was a place to go if you didn't afford the housing. It's got to the point where everybody's getting pushed out further and further. And where are they gonna go? They can't afford to go to Colleyville, Cordova, Germantown, Washington. So where are they gonna go when these properties are built up at $1,500 or more a month? There's nothing out there.
The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Y'all, there is a direct link in our society with what we have funded over the last 40 years, since the 70s and 80s, and what we have defunded. We have cut funding, literally gutted funding for HUD at the federal level. That happened in 1980 and 81, and it has never recovered. No administration has made restoring that a priority. No administration has made that a priority. And we've defunded all of these other social safety nets. What are we adding money to? Obviously the military, but what else are we adding money to really? Our jails, our prisons, and our policing. You do not fight poverty with policing. It doesn't work. So we have to be a louder voice. The only hope I can draw in the idea that we created, our society, our American society, created the inequality and the racism and the white supremacy and the housing injustice and all the healthcare injustice and everything else. We created that and legislated that in at a federal level and at the local levels too. The only hope in understanding the history of that is that if we created it, we can undo it.
Amen.
We can dismantle it. We can transform it. We can move past it with a broader imagination of what is possible. We know we want a community with housing for all, so how can we start moving the funding from incarcerating people into putting people into housing? The funding is already being spent there. It's already being spent in our hospital systems. It's already being spent, and it's more. So how can we transform that? We do a lot of work. We do most of our work at the local council level when it comes to Nashville. But we've had to get more savvy on the state level because that's where the trends are moving. And that's where we see big harm happening. And the state obviously preempts a local government, which y'all know from some living wage work that Memphis tried to do in the past, and we know from some inclusionary zoning work we tried to do in Nashville that was crushed by the state. So what does that mean? We have to organize. We have to organize, and we have to educate people. Because housing is best. Like, it is better for communities. We have family members, we have friends, we have loved ones that are experiencing this. So, I'll stop yakking for a minute and see if anybody else has questions or thoughts or realizations that they want to share, or also what you see happening in Memphis and Shelby County.
I was just gonna say, I was looking at the website for that institute. They have multiple things that they're working on. And I'm curious if there's a correlation there between what you're seeing with LGBTQ deals, the Don't Say Gay in Florida, and criminalization of HIV, and abortion, Roe versus Wade. It's very interesting to me, like, what are we all about? You know,
Yeah.
what are we pushing here?
So, in the small sense, like in the limited sense, a lot of us are in the housing justice work, or a lot of y'all are also doing criminal justice work, right? But in the broader sense, the thing that is connecting all of these issues is what some people call like working toward collective liberation, working toward a world where none of us are free until all of us are free, understanding the interconnectedness of these struggles, how deeply interconnected they are, and working toward a society where everybody has housing, yes. Nobody is wrongfully incarcerated, and we don't have mass incarceration, yes. But also, everyone is more free to thrive, not just to survive. Not just to survive, but everybody has the ability to thrive. And that is that's the larger picture that we kind of have on the horizon always at Open Table Nashville. It's why we work with a lot of other groups beyond just homelessness and housing services. That's why lobbyists came to our aid when we were scrambling. We didn't think we knew any lobbyists, and they were like, "We'll help you with this for free because this is terrible, and you've helped us." You know, that's that connectedness. That's that collective liberation. So that is a bigger picture that I do think we're trying to see.
You have done a phenomenal feat in 41 Tennessee counties to hear your message and grasp with these concepts. I'm wondering, does your website or your agency have any talking points, or what's been successful?
That's a really good question.
You have to take it to that place that is sitting out.
Yes, totally. So I think building talking points is one of the next roles, right? One of the next things that we need. One of the ways that we've mobilized 41, at least a couple people from that many counties, is through interacting with the faith communities, right? We have, there's not all very grounded, very developed social services and homeless outreach groups in every county. But there are faith communities, and they should believe in the humanity, the sacred humanity of every person. So can we go go there. We're an interfaith organization at Open Table Nashville. I'm a minister. I serve in the interfaith capacity at Open Table, but my roots are in the Christian tradition. And when I go to the legislature, I wear my collar. And when I risk arrest, I wear my collar. But how can we meet people on their level and talk about what's important to them and help them understand that the sacredness of humanity is at stake with laws that are dehumanizing like this? So that's one of the things that we're interested in doing in Tennessee, is mobilizing the service provider community, and the activist community and advocate community, but also the faith community, because that's a huge part of Tennessee. So we have to do that too, I think.
When you talk about the faith communities, I'm a faith outreach liaison, specialist here in the Memphis area, but what can the faith communities do right now and be an active piece in humanity and all, in social justice and all these things? What can the faith community do?
I see a lot of really good things happening when faith communities come alongside frontline groups that are boots on the ground doing the work and support, volunteer, help fund, and really help the groups that are on the ground doing the evidence-based practice work to end homelessness. So those kind of partnerships, I think, are incredibly rich. And I think educating their communities about what's happening and mobilizing them in elections and legislative sessions. Our legislative session really runs from January to like April-ish. It's a short session, and it's very intense for those of y'all who have worked on state legislation before. You know how intense that season is. So how can we mobilize them in those moments? I think is really important, and educate them. Other things, I talked really fast, and then I wanted to leave lots of room for talk, which we've had, but we still have a few more minutes. So other things we want to go back to, or other things that you have questions about or that you're seeing here as important.
I attend the church in Memphis on the Sycamore View corridor, and we recently started serving meals every other Wednesday to the homeless who are also drug addicted. Many of them have told us that they come from cities as far as the West Coast. When we ask them, where are you from? Very few of them say they're actually from Tennessee. There's something on the web that talks about the drug corridor. So they come to Memphis, and they're right off the interstate on Sycamore View. And there are many hotels on the Sycamore View Strip. And there's prostitution there. There are many things going on there, but many of them have had tents. There are many dilapidated businesses there, and so they're behind the businesses, and they set up tents, and they're community, and they look after each other.
Yeah.
But over the past 2 weeks, there's some city officials have run them off and told them they can't be there anymore. And so our church is really, we have coat drives, we have, we hand out the basic needs to them, we give them gift cards so they can buy food. And we're there even in the winter time, in the fall when there's rain, and we give them tarps. But now they're finding that they're being pushed out because there's, in the city, there are people who are saying you can't be there because they're reaching out to the people who own that property to run them away. There's a Jiffy Lube on Sycamore View, and it's open, it's dilapidated, and so people go in there at night, they sleep in there. One night we walked address this area because it's a real concern. And a lot of those people don't seek help, because, you know, they live in their own communities, they wait till they get very, very sick. We even had someone who passed away behind McDonald's. And he had come from Alabama. And you don't hear about it on the news.
No. That's why we have to tell these stories. Like, I didn't know that that existed in Memphis.
Oh, yeah.
The kind of storytelling you're doing right now is crucial. And we have to involve the people who are there and the solutions too, right? Because the folks there are the people that know best what the folks there need. So making sure their voices are not discounted from what happens to that community is going to be really important. There's going to be a time that faith communities have to begin to pray with our feet, which is one of the, so like in this civil rights movement, there was this Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. His family had been killed by Nazis who fled Poland and came to the US and saw the same kind of oppression happening here in the Jim Crow South, right? So he joined up with Martin Luther King and others, and he said as he was marching in Alabama, he felt as if his feet were praying. And I know this is not a faith community space, but those of us who are motivated by our conscience and by our faith have to put those things into action. So we need our faith communities, we need our service providers. We partner with the folks most directly affected in building power together so that we can change the narrative of what's happening in our state. Because the narrative of what's happening in our state now is terrible.
And that's a good point. I think that we do need to have these conversations, not to work in silos, because there are groups that are working in that area. A Better Way is over there, and their thing is a needle exchange.
And needle exchange programs, yeah, incredible.
And so, you know, but all of that doesn't always resonate with some faith groups too. So, you know, but I do think all of the things that are going on in that area, people need to come together and figure out how can we really best serve.
The stronger, the more we come together, the stronger we are. And I'll close with that because I know it's time. Claire and I from Open Table Nashville will be in the back after the next session in that lobby area. We would love to connect with y'all, have cards. We'd love to meet you and exchange numbers or emails or whatever. But thank you so much for having us. We love the work that we hear about happening here and want to get to know y'all better and figure out how we can all be in solidarity more. So thank you so much.